There are as many different reasons for being here this afternoon as there are people in the room. My friends and Judy's siblings, Mother's bridge partners, me and my brother David, my son Dan, we're all differently motivated, and there are some reasons we all have in common. One of the reasons I'm here is to tell you about Joan Crimmins' life. She didn't say much about the things that made it so admirable. If I don't, most of you will never know the ups and downs and the details that made it a pretty good story. Telling it in the context of this solemn event may make you remember her fondly in the days to come, and even the years ahead. Those of you who are here for my sake or my brother David's, or Judy's, or Beth's, or for the people from Barkley Farms who will miss her, have my permanent gratitude. Thank you all very much for coming. My mother's life had three major parts or phases. There's up until the age of 14. Then there's her life with our father, her husband Arthur, from when they were both 14 in 1945 until 1989 when Dad died. And the last part is from then, when she was 58 years old, until the last week of January of this year, when she passed away at the age of 86. She would be the first to tell us that the 41 years that she was with Dad were the ones that mattered most, so that's the period I'll speak of most. She was born in her grandfather's house on Webster Avenue in Scranton, Pennsylvania in 1930. Her father worked for the City Parks and Recreation Department, organizing youth sports leagues. The Rosensteels lived in Joan's maternal grandfather's home. He was a chiropractor, which was a good profession, but not so good that they didn't have to grow a lot of their own food in the backyard garden. After all, it was a depression. Edward Rosensteel, Joan's father, got a job in 1943 with the USO in the Tidewater region of Virginia. Joan and Artie, as he was known, met in school in 1944 and became a couple in the spring of that year. They were married less than 3 years later when they were both 17 in the winter of 1948. Their daughter Diane arrived in 1949, and by the end of 1955, the family included David and me. Bearing and caring for 3 kids was the hard job in the early years, but Dad was working hard too. By the time my brother David was born, Art and Joan had lived in 12 homes in 5 cities, so he must have had numerous jobs by 1954. The only one I knew of was as a steel worker in a plant near Pittsburgh. Otherwise, I don't know what all the jobs were at that time. I do know that the job he held for most of those years was at the Newport News Forms Company as a night shift machine operator, producing multi-part forms. At that time, he also worked during the day as a machinist at a shop, either owned by a friend or a friend's father. Another thing that Dad did during that time, and the thing that would have the most bearing on his future, was to educate himself in electronics. Referring to her as mother was at her insistence. By the time David and I were teenagers, she let us call her Mom, but before we moved to New Jersey when I was 12, she was Mother, and that was it. Calling her Mom or Mommy was corrected as quickly as incorrect grammar or flawed table manners. Today I'm glad and a little proud to refer to her with the more dignified Mother. To me, that always represented a special and natural form of respect that I had for her and that she had for herself. Art and Joan bought a house in 1960 when I was 5 years old on Windmill Point, a tiny peninsula on a body of water called Back River. Many years later, Mother told me that it came about when a friend of theirs died at a very young age, and they realized that life was short and should be lived to the fullest. A house on the water and a boat was a good way to fulfill that goal. We were there for 7 years. Around 1962 or so, Dad felt he knew enough of circuits and solder joints to apply for a job at NASA at Langley Field. He was nothing if not self-confident, and he got the job. Project Mercury started at Langley Field in Hampton, and Dad applied for a job there as a technician with a Bell & Howell subsidiary called Consolidated Electrodynamics Corporation. It was great fun telling schoolmates that my father worked for Consolidated Electrodynamics Corporation on the same project as Alan Shepard and John Glenn. We were immensely proud of him. Mother was a source of great pride too, because around the same time, She and Dad took a course in accounting together, and Mother went to work too in an accounting firm. So things were going well, but Dad always sought more. So in 1965, he leased a large tract of land, and we built a golf driving range. I was 9 and David 10 when we worked with Dad every day that summer to clear the land, build the tee line and the clubhouse, and to install a new kind of putting green that he could have patented. He paid us 25 cents an hour, which I weakly tried to refuse. He said that was silly and that I was worth $3 a day. Still not satisfied, he decided to build a huge saltwater pool on the property so we could have a dolphin show, just like SeaWorld. So the next summer, the whole family went to Florida and attended literally every dolphin show in the state, so Dad could learn how it's done and arranged to have 2 bottlenose dolphins trucked up to Virginia. One of Dad's friends was a horse trainer, so he was hired to tend to the animals and run the show. Flipper was on TV then, and our operation really made a splash. Dad wouldn't let us swim with the dolphins, who were named Mickey and Arnie after a woman golf pro and Arnold Palmer. But I did feed them and even worked in the show sometimes. One of the tricks was for me to stand on a platform high above the water and lean out with a smelt in my teeth for Mickey and Arnie to snatch. I usually closed my eyes because my job was to stay still and not drop the fish. If I did my part, the dolphin would emerge from the water at exactly the right speed to reach the fish. I didn't know anything about the finances until one Saturday morning in 1967, Dad told us that we were moving to New Jersey. The business had failed. He had been rehired by Bell and Howell, and we were leaving our home on the water for the Philadelphia suburbs. The news broke my heart because our home on Back River on the tiny peninsula called Windmill Point was paradise to me. It was a good move for Art and Joan, though, because it came with a lot of opportunities. For Joan, it meant a job in the city at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital, no less. For Dad, it meant new horizons. In the southern direction from our home in West Everett, New Jersey, the horizons stretched to Wilmington, where Dad became the Director of Marketing for All American Engineering. In about 10 years, this guy, due in no small measure to Joan's support, went from running a machine on the night shift to being an executive in a company that was a spin-off of All American Aviation, which is now U.S. Air. Jersey was the right move for him, for sure. But again, there was no stopping Art and Joan. Real good was not good enough. The main thing that Dad was trying to sell at All American was garbage incineration for energy generation. Somehow, designers and manufacturers of aircraft arresting gear had become alternative energy developers, and it was Dad's job to convince municipalities on the eastern seaboard that they could turn their garbage into steam and electricity. It's a cool idea, and it works, sort of. So Dad seized another opportunity, 2 years before the famous Arab oil embargo, leaving his great job at All American to buy a failing steam heat utility in Philadelphia for $1. It became another wild ride for our family because it was the only time we had any real money. Mother became the company's comptroller, and it was the first time of many that she and Dad would work side by side. In addition to 3 functioning steam heat plants, that dollar bought a huge tax liability, as well as the wrath of some old, if not venerable, Philadelphia institutions. So those problems and others brought about the demise of that portion of the second phase of Mother's life. All American took Dad back, which is another testament to his worth. Dad's employers were always sorry to see him leave, and always welcomed him back. He was no bridge burner. Which was again bad news for me, because I had adjusted to life in South Jersey quite well. But Art and Joan were excellent at providing for their children. They made every house we were in a true home, and the conditions of our lives about as good as they could be. I realize now that I probably owe my ability to adapt, then and now, to them. By the time Dad went back to All American, the company had hatched another ambitious plan. It was a thing called the Aerocrane, which was a balloon with wings. The idea was to attach a rotor disc to a spherical balloon, make it spin, and use helium and the spinning airfoils to lift and fly away with a lot of weight, like 100 times the weight that a helicopter can. There was a problem with the Aerocrane that made it impractical, so Dad came up with a variation that he called the Cyclocrane. Eventually, it proved to be impractical too, but for Dad and Mom, and eventually me and Judy, proof became the operative word. for it took most of the 1980s for that proof to be established. Doing so brought Joan to the final years of her time with Art, but they were the most amazing of all. Dad and Don Doolittle, the top engineer for All American, who was the inventor of the aerocrane and the president of the company when he retired, got a patent for the cyclocrane and founded a corporation to develop it. Dad's efforts to get the money for the enterprise took them to Montreal. Joan and Art lived there for 5 months while Dad convinced Canadian logging companies they needed cyclocranes. With that mission accomplished, they moved back to the States to build the proof of concept model. Don had retired to Boston, Maryland, but he agreed to make it a semi-retirement in order to help design and build the first cyclocrane, the proof of concept model. Mom and Dad rented a house on the water just a couple miles from Don's, and the three of them, along with Bob Kaufman, another ex-All-American employee, started making drawings, cutting aluminum, and making plans for the birth of the first new major aircraft configuration since the helicopter. Those were 2 very good years for them. They were living on the water again, and Dad was living a dream, selling his ideas and physically building them. Don's garage was equipped with a milling machine, a lathe, and everything else they needed, so Dad was milling, turning, cutting, and drilling bronze, aluminum, and steel as he had in Hampton years before. When I joined the project, he taught me how to do it. It was great. You can make the parts just about anywhere, but you can't assemble a 178-foot long aircraft with a 140-foot wingspan in a garage, or even in a big yard, although that idea was considered at one time. You need a hangar, and not just any hangar. What was needed was one of the biggest hangars in the world, 2 of which were in Tillamook, Oregon on the Pacific coast, so that's where we went in June of 1981. By then, Joan and Art had lived in exactly 23 different homes. I found her list. So moving was something they had a lot of experience with, but this was the granddaddy of all moves. All the tools, equipment, and furniture the company owned, cyclocrane parts, and 10 households, because that's how many employees there were making the move, had to be packed, loaded, unloaded, and unpacked. We rented 3 big rigs, semi-trucks with full-size trailers for the job, and it took weeks, actually longer, because most of us had to find houses or apartments after we got there. Most of us lived with Mom and Dad while we were looking. For the next 16 months, we finished making the parts and assembling the thing. In October of 1982, we took it outside to fly it.
I'm the most excited I've ever been in my life. We've been working at this for so long, and at last, just to see with the blue sky behind it instead of in the hangar, it's just wonderful.
But a couple weeks later, before we could make the first flight, a storm ripped the cyclocrane from the mast and wrecked it. That day, Dad said that we would rebuild it, and I think the only one of us who believed him was his wife. But he was right. The insurance paid off. ILC, down the road here in Frederica, patched up the envelope, and 2 years after it was in pieces in a cow pasture, the cyclocrane flew, with me, Dad, Bill Giordano, and the pilot, J.J. Morris, on board, and my mother on the ground, watching it all. When the cyclocrane was wrecked, there were about 30 people on the project. Almost all of them stayed to see it fly. After that first flight, we did many more, and I really thought we were going to succeed. It was very exciting. It soon became clear, however, that despite our success, moving forward would be very difficult. Commercialization of the concept would take many years and hundreds of millions of dollars. And in the early 1980s, that kind of money wasn't available for just about anything, much less for something as improbable as a balloon with wings. So in 1985, even though it was his invention and his dream, Dad left it to others. Mother and Dad and Judy and I, with our boys Danny and Pat, moved to Los Angeles. I got a job with a helicopter manufacturer, and Dad became a consultant. They got an upper floor apartment on Wilshire Boulevard, which was pretty cool. My job didn't pan out, but I got a better one in Florida, so we left, leaving Mom and Dad. But they left too, and moved to Pennsylvania, to the neighborhood next door to David and Beth, who also had kids for Mom to fuss over. Once again, Mother got a job handling the books and finances for a company that bought and sold caustic soda by the trainload. Like Dad, Mom could always get a good job. When we were going through the papers last week, We found all the letters of recommendation she'd received from her employers over the years. There was one from the accounting firm in Virginia, the University of Pennsylvania, the Delaware Curative Workshop, and a couple more. They were all effusive, glowing recommendations that couldn't have praised her work ethic, skills, intelligence, and character more highly. One from a doctor at the University of Pennsylvania said that when they learned she was leaving, he and the other doctors offered her a significant salary increase for her to stay. Another wrote that since her reason for leaving was because she was moving to Wilmington and the commute was too great, that couldn't she ride the train or a helicopter? I assume he was kidding about the helicopter. In another letter of recommendation, the author said that Joan's role in implementing a computer-based accounting system had been invaluable to the firm, and he praised her skills and knowledge in that field. The letter was written in 1971. She had skills in computer applications and systems when Bill Gates was a sophomore in high school. Back in Pennsylvania, Dad worked on another invention, a device dubbed the Quill. It was sort of a super keyboard with tactile feedback. With it, a trained operator could type 1,000 words per minute. The tactile feedback aspect was done with pneumatic pillows at the user's fingertips, and that feature had robotics applications by giving operators of mechanical arms a sense of how hard they are gripping something. NASA funded it with a DARPA contract as something to be added to the robotic arm used on the space shuttle. Project engineering of the type that Dad had done for so long takes a toll. The need to be creative and inventive in engineering like that on a continuous basis is very difficult. When the projects fail, it wears you down. It wore him down. The last few years are a long, hard story, but to sum it up, by 1989, he didn't want to take it anymore, so he didn't. He got out. She never got over Dad's death. If two people are ever truly joined into some single entity, Art and Joan are it. Without him, she wasn't complete. It took a while, but she did manage to have a little fun without her husband. She definitely enjoyed her family until the end. She continued to read at least the same pace she always had, finishing a couple of books a week. And thanks to a few ladies here today, she continued to play bridge and deprive friends of pocket change. She really liked that. And she did enjoy her independence. Dad couldn't stay, but he didn't leave without providing materially for her life without him, and Mother worked for a few more years to make it possible for her to finally own her own house, and then get another one here 18 years ago. With that, she became closer to Judy and me, and we got together with her pretty often. We all liked that. This was a great place for her. I offered to build a house for her next to ours. I even designed it for her, but she turned me down flat. She wanted to be here in Barclay Farms on her own. So her life with us after Dad was worthwhile, and I'm very grateful for the time we had when it was just her. I'm more grateful for the great things she did for him and with him, and for me and my family. Her entire life was worthy of the respect that these brief words humbly seek to render. There is a legacy, and sublimely beautiful reasons for us to be here. Thank you, all of you, for coming today to recognize them.